He stood at the grave of a patient he couldn't save, a failure that had haunted his days and stolen his sleep for years. The memory of her smile, a final flicker of light in a losing battle, was etched into his soul. He went there seeking a quiet moment of closure, a private conversation with the past. But he wasn't alone. A sound broke the silence, a heart-wrenching sob that pulled him from his thoughts. There, kneeling on the fresh grass, was a woman he had never seen before. Her shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it seemed to chill the very air. And clinging to her side, a little girl with wide, confused eyes holding a single wilted flower. He was about to turn away to respect their private mourning when the woman looked up, her tear-streaked face revealing a truth so shocking it would unravel everything he thought he knew about that fateful day. This is the story of Dr. Mateus and the day he discovered his greatest failure was, in fact, a hidden miracle. My feet felt rooted to the damp earth, the scent of rain-soaked soil and decaying flowers filling my senses as I stared at the woman and the child. The air was thick with a silence that was heavier than any I had ever known in an operating room. I had come to the cemetery for solitude, to finally voice the apology that had been lodged in my throat for 3 long years, an apology meant only for the silent granite marker that bore the name Isabella. I never expected an audience for my shame. The woman's sobs were a raw physical thing, tearing through the quiet afternoon. Her dark hair was a stark contrast against the simple black dress she wore, and the little girl, who couldn't have been more than 4 or 5, pressed her face into the woman's side, her small fist clutching a daisy that had long since lost its battle with the world. Everything in my professional training screamed at me to retreat, to give them this sacred space for their grief. A doctor is a guest in these moments, an intruder unless invited. But as I took a half step back, a twig snapped under my shoe. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. Her head snapped up, our eyes met, and in that single suspended moment, I saw it, not just grief, but a profound, earth-shattering recognition. She knew who I was. Her eyes, red-rimmed and swimming with tears, widened not in confusion, but in a startling, almost fearful awareness. It was a look that bypassed all social convention and went straight to the core of a shared, terrible history I didn't know we had. "You," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, a single word that carried the weight of an entire untold story. The little girl peeked out from behind her mother's leg, her big brown eyes curious and unafraid. I was paralyzed, my own prepared speech to a ghost forgotten. How did she know me? The funeral had been a blur of faces, a sea of strangers. I couldn't properly see through the haze of my own guilt. I had stood at the back, a penitent in a white coat, and left before the final prayer. I'm sorry to intrude," I managed to say, my own voice sounding foreign and weak. "I was just paying my respects." The woman, whose name I would later learn was Elena, slowly rose to her feet, one hand protectively resting on her daughter's head. She didn't wipe her tears away. They simply continued their quiet journey down her cheeks. "Dr. Mateus," she said, and the way she pronounced my name, with a soft Spanish accent that curled around the syllables, confirmed it. She hadn't just seen me at the funeral, she knew me from before. "You were her doctor," she stated, her gaze unwavering. It wasn't a question. A cold dread began to creep up my spine, intertwining with the vines of my long-held remorse. Isabella's case was the specter that haunted my career, a vibrant young woman, a dancer from Madrid who had come to the United States on a scholarship, struck down by a sudden, aggressive cardiomyopathy. We fought for her in the ICU for weeks. I had been so sure, so arrogantly confident that we could stabilize her, that a new medication regimen would turn the tide. I remember the late nights reviewing her charts, the determined hope in her eyes when I'd assure her we were making progress. But her heart was too damaged. It gave out on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was rising. I had pronounced her death, my hands feeling useless and heavy at my sides. The memory of her mother's wail from the hallway was a sound I could never forget. I had replayed every decision, every dosage, every single moment of her care 1,000 times, convinced that my hubris, my failure to see the rapid decline sooner, was what had truly killed her. And now, here was this woman, Elena, whose grief felt just as fresh and sharp as it had been on that day, standing before me as a living, breathing testament to my failure. I think about her every day, I said, the confession torn from me. It was the truth, but it felt inadequate, a pebble thrown into an ocean of sorrow. There wasn't a thing more we could have done. I am so deeply sorry. I expected her to nod in quiet acceptance or perhaps to turn away in anger. I did not expect the strange, almost pitying look that softened her features. "You don't understand," she murmured, her eyes flicking down to the little girl, Sophia, who was now quietly tracing patterns in the dirt with her flower. "You couldn't have known." The statement was so incongruous with the scene, so antithetical to the narrative of blame I had constructed for myself, that it left me disoriented. What couldn't I have known? That her heart was too weak? That my treatment plan was flawed? I knew all of that. I had lived with that knowledge. Elena took a shaky breath, her composure a fragile shield. "Isabella was my sister," she said, and the new information landed like a blow. "She wasn't just your patient. She was my older sister. And Sophia is her daughter." She looked at me, her expression a complex tapestry of sorrow, gratitude, and a profound, unsettling secret. "We come here so she can know her mother. We tell her stories." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A daughter? Isabella had never mentioned a child. There was no record of a daughter in her file. The pieces of my memory, the foundation of my guilt, began to shift and crack, unable to accommodate this new, impossible truth. The words, "Sophia is her daughter," hung in the air between us, not as a simple statement of fact, but as a seismic shock that threatened the very bedrock of my reality. A daughter. Isabella had a daughter. My mind, a well-trained machine for processing complex medical data, short-circuited. It frantically searched the archives of my memory, pulling the thick, metaphorical file on Isabella. There was nothing. No mention of a pregnancy during her initial workup, no casual comment in our long conversations about her life back in Spain, no emergency contact listed other than her mother. It was a void, a black hole of information where a son should have been. I stared at the little girl, Sophia, and for the first time, I truly saw her. I saw the same dark, expressive eyes that had once held so much hope in a hospital bed. I saw the same curve of the cheek, the same determined set of the jaw. The resemblance was so striking it was painful, a living echo of the woman I had failed to save. I didn't know," I stammered, the words utterly insufficient. The guilt, which had been a heavy, familiar stone in my gut, suddenly transformed into something else, a sharp, piercing confusion. Why had this been kept from me? What else didn't I know? Elena watched the turmoil play out on my face, her own expression a mixture of exhaustion and a deep, resonant empathy. She knelt back down, pulling Sophia close, as if drawing strength from the small, warm body. No one knew, she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper meant for the three of us and the ghost that bound us together. Isabella was so young, and her career was everything. The father was not. He was not in the picture. She was terrified that the scholarship committee would find out, that they would revoke her opportunity. It was a different kind of fight, you see, a secret battle she waged alongside the one for her heart. She spoke with a quiet reverence, painting a picture of a woman I realized I had never truly known. I had seen Isabella the patient, the fascinating medical case, the tragic young dancer. I had never seen Isabella the mother, the fierce protector, the architect of a beautiful hidden life. The arrogance of that oversight washed over me, cold and humiliating. I had been so focused on the rhythm of her heart on the monitor that I had been deaf to the silent, powerful rhythm of her heart as a parent. She was 4 months pregnant when she first started feeling the shortness of breath, Elena continued, her gaze distant, lost in the memory. She thought it was just a pregnancy. She hid it from everyone, even from our mother at first. By the time the cardiomyopathy was diagnosed, she was too far along. The risks, they were unimaginable. A cold dread, entirely different from the warm guilt I was accustomed to, began to seep into my bones. I was a cardiologist. I knew with terrifying clinical clarity what a pregnancy did to a compromised heart. The increased blood volume, the strain, the hormonal changes. It was a perfect storm, a relentless physiological assault. My mind, now working with this new horrifying variable, began to recalculate everything. The sudden, aggressive decline I had blamed on my own miscalculations. Could it have been the simple, brutal, and inevitable progression of a pregnancy her heart was never meant to sustain? The medication I had been so confident in, was it even safe for the fetus? 1,000 new questions erupted, each one more damning than the last. When she was admitted to the ICU under your care, Elena said, pulling me from the nightmarish spiral of my thoughts, her only prayer was not for herself. It was for the baby. She made me promise. She made the nurses promise. No one was to know. She was afraid that if the doctors knew, they would prioritize her life over the baby's or make medical choices that could harm her child. She believed with every fiber of her being that her own heart was a lost cause, but that her daughter's was worth any sacrifice. I felt the air leave my lungs as if I'd been punched. The private conversations I'd had with Isabella, the hope I'd tried to instill in her. Had she been secretly resigned to her fate all along, simply using her dwindling strength to shield her child? Had my attempts at optimism felt like a cruel joke to her? The image of her, lying in that sterile bed, guarding her greatest secret, while I talked confidently about ejection fractions and beta blockers, was almost too much to bear. My failure was no longer just a matter of medical error. It felt like a profound spiritual blindness. I had been trying to fix a broken pump, completely unaware that I was standing in the presence of a sacred covenant between a mother and her unborn child. Elena's voice broke through my internal cataclysm. The day she died, it was also the day she gave birth. It was an emergency C-section just minutes after you left the room. She looked at Sophia, her eyes brimming with a love so immense it seemed to defy the sorrow surrounding us. They tried to save Isabella, but her heart had given its very last beat. It had done its final, most important job. It had held on just long enough. Sophia, sensing the weight of the moment, looked up at her aunt and then at me, her small face serious. "Mama is an angel," she stated, with the simple, unshakable faith of a child. And in that moment, The narrative I had carried for 3 years, the story of Dr. Mateus and his greatest failure, shattered into a million pieces. It wasn't a story of failure at all. It was a story of a mother's impossible sacrificial love. My perceived incompetence, the decisions I had agonized over, had all unfolded within a context I was deliberately kept from. I hadn't failed to save her. I had, in my ignorant, flailing way, been a part of the team that helped her complete her ultimate mission. The guilt didn't vanish, but it transformed, melting into a staggering, overwhelming awe for the woman whose grave I stood before. She hadn't been a victim of my hubris. She had been a hero, and I had been too blind to see it. It's incredible how a single conversation can completely rewrite the story of your life, isn't it? I'd love to know where in the world you're listening to this story right now. If you're comfortable sharing, please tell me the name of your city in the comments below. It feels like we're having this conversation together, and I'm curious about the community that is sharing in this moment of revelation with me. The silence that followed Elena's revelation was not empty. It was thick with the unspoken weight of a truth that had been buried for years. I stood there, a doctor who had built his entire understanding of a profound professional tragedy on a foundation of incomplete information, and felt the ground beneath me become unstable. My gaze was locked on Sophia, this beautiful, living child, and I could no longer see just a little girl. I saw a miracle. I saw the triumphant, beating heart of my former patient, a heart I had believed I had failed, now existing outside of her body, walking and talking and holding a wilted flower. The clinical part of my brain, the part that needed data and explanations, finally caught up with the emotional tsunami. "A C-section," I repeated, the words feeling foreign and clinical on my tongue. Minutes after, I couldn't finish the sentence. The memory of that Tuesday morning rushed back, not as a hazy recollection of grief, but with a new, terrifying clarity. I had left Isabella's room after pronouncing her, my own heart, a lead weight. The sounds of the code team finally standing down, and the wails of her mother from the hallway forming the soundtrack to my shame. I had walked away, believing the story was over, but it wasn't. While I was retreating down the hallway, steeped in my own perceived failure, a different, more urgent drama was unfolding behind me. A surgical team was being rushed in, working against time, not to save the mother, but to rescue the child she had protected with a secrecy so absolute it had rewritten the meaning of her entire medical journey. Elena watched me process this, her eyes holding a deep, weary understanding. "She made us all swear," she whispered, her voice cracking with the memory of that promise. The nurses who suspected, the one resident who had wondered, she begged us. Her life, she said, was a price she was willing to pay. But her baby's life was non-negotiable. I thought of the senior nurse, Clara, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, who had sometimes given me a strange, almost pitying look during Isabella's final days. I had mistaken it for judgment of my medical skills, but now I realized it was the look of someone holding a devastating secret, watching me operating in the dark. The entire medical narrative I had constructed, the aggressive treatment, the confident predictions, the sudden, inexplicable crash, began to reconfigure itself around this central hidden fact. Isabella's body wasn't just fighting cardiomyopathy, it was performing the immense physiological labor of creating a new life. Every drug I administered, every fluid balance I calculated, was interacting not with one patient, but with two. The inexplicable instability I had charted, the parameters that sometimes veered wildly from what I expected, they weren't a mystery born of my incompetence. They were the logical, predictable result of a pregnancy straining a dying heart. A cold, sickening realization dawned on me. The medication, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The regimen I put her on, the high-dose ACE inhibitors. I didn't need to finish. The color drained from Elena's face, confirming my worst fear. ACE inhibitors are notoriously teratogenic, known to cause severe, often fatal birth defects. It was a standard, effective treatment for her condition, but it was a poison for a fetus. I had prescribed it with confidence, with the certainty of a physician following established protocols for a woman I believed was otherwise healthy. I had been meticulously managing a time bomb, completely unaware that the countdown was for 2 lives, not 1. The arrogance of that ignorance was a physical nausea rising in my throat. "She knew," Alina said, her voice thick with a mixture of pride and anguish. "She looked it up. She knew the risks to the baby. But she was trapped. To refuse the treatment would have raised your suspicions, and her secret would be revealed. To take it, it was a gamble with her daughter's life. So she did the only thing she could think of. She pretended to take the pills. She would hide them in her cheek, and when you and the nurses left, she would spit them out." The world tilted on its axis. The non-compliance I had never suspected, the reason her blood levels of the medication were sometimes curiously low. A detail I had dismissed as a lab error or variable absorption, it had all been a deliberate, desperate act of maternal sabotage. She wasn't a passive recipient of my care. She was an active, secret agent in her own and her daughter's story, making impossible choices in the shadows. My treatment plan, the very cornerstone of my perceived failure, had been systematically undermined by my patient in a breathtaking act of defiance and love. I hadn't failed to save her because my medicine was wrong. In a way, I had failed because my medicine, had it been followed, would have killed the very miracle I was now staring at. The conflict was no longer a simple matter of a doctor's mistake. It was a cosmic collision between blind clinical science and the fierce, primal instinct of a mother. I was the representative of a system that saw a broken organ, while she was the guardian of a sacred life. My greatest regret was suddenly reframed as the very thing that had, inadvertently, allowed her plan to succeed. My ignorance was the necessary condition for her sacrifice. This was the point of Virata, the moment the entire architecture of my guilt collapsed and was rebuilt into something far more complex and humbling. I was not the tragic hero of this story. I was a bit player, an unwitting and clumsy instrument in a narrative of love so vast it had willingly embraced death as its price. The grave I stood before was not a monument to my failure, but a testament to a victory I had been too blind to comprehend. The weight of Alina's confession settled upon me not as a burden, but as a shattering of my entire reality. The clinical, orderly world I inhabited, where diagnoses were clear and treatment plans were followed, evaporated into a mist of heartbreaking complexity. Isabella hadn't been a non-compliant patient. She had been a revolutionary, waging a secret war against the very medicine meant to save her, all for the sake of the daughter she would never hold. I looked at my own hands, the hands that had written those prescriptions, and for a moment they felt like the hands of a stranger, instruments of a potential tragedy that had been narrowly averted by a mother's profound cunning. The challenges she faced in that sterile hospital room were of a magnitude I could scarcely comprehend. Every day was a high-wire act of deception, a performance for the doctors and nurses who moved around her with a confident authority that was, in her reality, a dire threat. She had to monitor her own symptoms with a double consciousness, deciphering which were signs of her failing heart and which were the normal yet terrifying processes of a pregnancy she had to hide. The shortness of breath I attributed to fluid in her lungs was also the breathlessness of a woman carrying a child. The fatigue I saw as a sign of her heart's weakness was also the profound exhaustion of creating a new life while her own was fading. Her greatest challenge, the one that must have haunted her every waking moment, was the constant, looming presence of discovery. Every ultrasound she secretly arranged and attended with Elena, using a fake name and paying in cash, was a mission fraught with peril. Every time a nurse entered the room, she had to be ready with a smile to hide the fear. To perform the role of the hopeful patient while her body was a battlefield, she had to decipher our medical jargon, listening to our rounds not for guidance on her own health, but for any hint that we suspected the truth. She had to be a student of her own demise, learning just enough about her condition to know how to convincingly fake the symptoms we expected to see, all while secretly praying her heart would hold out for just a few more weeks, just a few more days. The emotional toll must have been catastrophic. The isolation of bearing such a secret, the terror that a single misplaced word from a well-meaning relative or a too perceptive look from a nurse would unravel everything. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone in the most important fight of her life. And then there was me, Dr. Mateus, her primary physician. I was, without ever knowing it, her greatest antagonist and her most useful pawn. My confidence, my detailed explanations of her treatment plan, my assurances that we were fighting this together, all of it was a script she had to carefully navigate. My presence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, my focus on her cardiomyopathy, my determination to fix the mechanical problem of her heart, provided the perfect smokescreen for her true condition. My arrogance in believing I had the full picture made me blind to the subtext of every conversation, every hesitant pause, every time she changed the subject away from her long-term prognosis. On the other hand, I was the source of the poison pills, the embodiment of the clinical protocol that threatened her child. The challenge of deceiving me, of looking me in the eye day after day and pretending to share my hope, all while systematically undermining my every medical decision, must have required a strength of will that dwarfed the physical strength her body was losing. She wasn't just fighting a disease, she was fighting her own doctor, using my ignorance as her primary shield. The logistical challenges were a nightmare of their own. The act of not taking the medication was a delicate, dangerous ballet. She had to time it perfectly, hiding the pills during our visits, knowing that a single slip, a single pill discovered under her tongue or in her bedsheets would bring her entire world crashing down. She had to rely on a network of conspirators, Elena, and likely a few trusted nurses who turned a blind eye out of a respect for her sacrifice that transcended hospital policy. They became her underground railroad, smuggling in information, moral support, and the sheer human comfort she was denied in her official role as a patient. They lived with the constant fear of being discovered, of losing their jobs, of facing legal repercussions, all for the sake of honoring a promise to a dying woman. This was not a simple case of patient non-compliance. It was a meticulously planned, courageously executed conspiracy of love, operating in the heart of a modern hospital, right under the noses of some of the best medical minds in the city. The hospital, a place I saw as a fortress of science and healing, had been the stage for a different kind of drama altogether, one where the protocols of medicine were pitted against the primal law of a mother's love, and the mother, through sheer force of will, was winning. The climax of this hidden war arrived not with a bang, but with the slow, terrifying decline I had documented in her chart with growing frustration and self-doubt. The complications I so carefully noted, the worsening edema, the plummeting blood pressure, the periods of arrhythmia, were not, as I had believed, evidence of my failing strategy. They were the final, desperate signals from a body being pushed beyond its absolute limit. Isabella's heart was not just failing, it was being systematically dismantled by the relentless, beautiful, and brutal demands of the new life growing within her. Every beat was a monumental effort, a rebellion against its own ruined anatomy. The day she died, that Tuesday morning, was the day her body could no longer sustain the duality of its existence. The secret she had protected so fiercely was on the verge of being exposed by the simple, undeniable fact of her physical collapse. The code blue that was called was, in truth, the final surrender of her maternal shield. Her body was giving up, but her will had one last monumental task to complete. I remember the chaos of that code with a new, horrifying clarity. The frantic calls for epinephrine, the rhythmic compressions on a chest that felt too fragile, the sharp crack of ribs under the force of our life-saving violence. I was the conductor of this frantic orchestra, shouting orders, my eyes glued to the flat line on the monitor, completely blind to the true drama unfolding. I didn't see the knowing, grim look exchanged between Nurse Clara and the resident. I didn't see Elena, who had been waiting in the family room, being pulled aside and spoken to in hushed, urgent tones. I was entirely focused on the single, lost cause of Isabella's heart, pouring all my knowledge, all my skill into restarting an engine that had, by its owner's design, been run into the ground for a higher purpose. When I finally called the time of death, a profound silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of our own heavy breathing and the retreating electronic whine of the monitors. The feeling of defeat was absolute, a cold, heavy blanket smothering me. I remember walking out, my shoulders slumped, avoiding the eyes of my team, feeling the weight of every single one of Isabella's unfulfilled dreams as my personal cross to bear. I believed I was walking away from my greatest failure, but I was walking away from a finish line, not a defeat. The moment the door swung shut behind me, the scene transformed. The solemn quiet of death was replaced by a different, more urgent kind of silence, the focused, determined quiet of a new mission. While I was in the hallway absorbing the first waves of my shame, a surgical team was already being mobilized. The code had been a diversion, a tragic but necessary public event that masked the private ticking clock. Isabella's body was not yet a corpse to be respected. It was a life support system with minutes left to fulfill its ultimate function. In a separate, prepared operating room down the hall, a team that had been quietly briefed and stood ready performed an emergency post-mortem cesarean section. There was no time for ceremony, no time for grief. There was only the race against irreversible fetal hypoxia. They worked with a swift, sacred efficiency, knowing they were harvesting the final, sacrificial gift of the woman on the table. The heartbeat they were listening for was not the one that had just stopped, but the one that was meant to begin. And it did. The cry that pierced the sterile air of that OR was not a sound of sorrow, but one of triumphant, defiant life. It was the sound of Sophia. It was the sound of Isabella's victory. Her heart, which I had failed to restart, had succeeded in its most critical task. It had pumped blood and oxygen just long enough, had held on with a tenacity that defied medical textbooks to sustain her daughter until the very moment of its final, exhausted contraction. My perceived failure, the moment I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times as the epitome of my professional inadequacy, was in fact the precise, preordained moment of her success. I had not been too late to save the mother. I had been exactly on time to unwittingly facilitate the salvation of the child. The guilt I had carried was a phantom pain, an ache for a limb that hadn't been lost but had been transformed into something new and beautiful. Standing there in the cemetery, with the truth finally spoken aloud, I felt that phantom limb for the first time. It was the limb of understanding, of connection to a story far greater than my own. The greatest tension was not in the medical mystery, but in the psychological and spiritual whiplash of having my entire reality inverted. The foundation of my professional identity for 3 years crumbled in an instant, and I was left standing in the rubble, not as a failed doctor, but as a witness to a miracle I had never intended to help create. This story forever changed my understanding of failure and sacrifice. It's a reminder that our perspective is always limited, and that the universe often works in ways we can't possibly foresee from our narrow vantage point. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think of a time when a seeming disaster in your own life revealed itself to be a hidden blessing, I would be so honored if you joined our community. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to share more of these profound human stories. And I would love to hear from you. In the comments below, if you feel comfortable, please share a moment from your own life where a difficult time eventually revealed a purpose or lesson you couldn't see at first. Let's create a space where we can support each other with our stories of hidden strength and unexpected grace. The silence that enveloped us in the cemetery was no longer one of shared grief, but of a profound, staggering reevaluation. The story I had told myself for 3 years, the narrative that had shaped my every waking moment and haunted my dreams, was not just inaccurate, it was a lie built on a foundation of deliberate omission. I looked from Elena's tear-streaked, resolute face to Sophia's innocent, curious eyes, and the final crumbling walls of my guilt did not fall into a pit of despair, but onto the fertile ground of a new, humbling understanding. My failure was not a medical one. It was a failure of perception. I had been so intent on reading the charts, the numbers, the rhythms on a screen, that I had been completely illiterate in the language of silent, sacrificial love being spoken right in front of me. The conflict wasn't between my skill and a disease. It was between my narrow, clinical worldview and a mother's boundless, strategic courage. And in that quiet, green space, surrounded by the dead, I began to feel the first stirrings of a resolution, not as an absolution of my role, but as a complete reinterpretation of it. I found my voice, though it was rough with an emotion I couldn't yet name. She beat us all, I said, the words feeling both strange and utterly true. She outmaneuvered an entire hospital. She outmaneuvered me. Elena gave a small, sad smile, one that held a universe of pride for her sister. She did, she whispered, her hand stroking Sophia's hair. She used the system to protect herself from the system. You were all pieces on her chessboard, and she was playing for a prize bigger than any of us could see. The metaphor was devastatingly accurate. I had been a key piece, the queen perhaps, moving with supposed authority, completely unaware that the game was being masterfully directed by the player I thought I was trying to save. The resolution began not with an action, but with this internal surrender, the surrender of my ego, my cherished narrative of fault, and my belief that I had ever been in control of the outcome. I had to let the old story die so that the true one could breathe. I began to ask questions, not as a doctor seeking a post-mortem, but as a man seeking to finally understand the full portrait of a person he had only ever seen in fragments. What was she like? I asked Elena, not as a patient, as a person, as a sister. And so, there, seated on a nearby bench with the gray headstone of Isabella in our line of sight, Elena began to paint a picture with her words. She spoke of a woman with a fiery spirit and a laugh that could fill a room. A dancer whose passion was not just for movement, but for life itself. She told me about the small, secret joys of the pregnancy, how Isabella would play music for her growing belly, how she and Elena would spend hours debating names, how she would talk to the baby, telling her about the world she would one day inherit, a world full of beauty and dance and love. She described the fear, yes, the bone-deep terror that shadowed every joyful moment. But she also described a determination so fierce it became a kind of light. This was the path to resolution, filling in the blanks, replacing the sterile image of the cardiomyopathy case in room 304 with the vibrant, complex, and heroic figure of Isabella, the dancer, the sister, the mother. As she spoke, Sophia, growing restless, began to wander a few feet away, picking dandelions from the grass. I watched her, this living, breathing resolution to the most painful chapter of my career. Every dandelion she blew, sending the tiny seeds spiraling into the air, felt like a blessing, a scattering of the very hope her mother had died to protect. My role in this story was being redefined in real time. I was not the villain, nor was I the failed hero. I was a witness. I was a crucial, if ignorant, part of the environment in which this miracle had taken place. My confidence had provided the smokescreen. My focused, narrow treatment had been the predictable threat that Isabella could strategically avoid. My perceived failure at the end had been the precise, necessary signal for the final, successful phase of her plan to begin. The path to closure was to stop trying to assign blame, to myself or to the cruel randomness of disease, and to instead accept my part in this intricate, painful, and beautiful tapestry. Elena and I talked for a long time, the afternoon sun casting long, soft shadows through the trees. We spoke of the years since, of her struggle to raise Sophia alone, of the bittersweet pain of watching her niece grow to look more and more like the sister she lost. I shared my own story, my 3 years of carrying this weight. The way it had changed my practice made me more cautious, more prone to doubt. It was a conversation that should have happened years ago, a missing piece of both our grieving processes finally clicking into place. The resolution was this connection, this shared understanding that bridged the chasm between the doctor who thought he had failed and the family who had seen his actions as part of a larger divine plan. I wasn't there to be forgiven. I was there to finally understand what there was to forgive, and in understanding, I found it was no longer necessary. Before we parted ways, Elena did something that finally broke the last remnants of the old story. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was of Isabella, not in a hospital bed, but in a dance studio, her body caught in a moment of graceful, powerful motion, a radiant smile on her face, one hand resting gently on her noticeably pregnant belly. "This is how I want you to remember her," Elena said softly, pressing the photo into my hand, not as she was at the end, but as she was in the middle of her fight, full of life, creating life. I looked at the photo, at the joy and determination etched on her face, and the final piece of the resolution settled into my soul. I was not the custodian of a tragic memory. I was now a guardian of a triumphant one. I had a new responsibility, to remember Isabella not for the heart that failed, but for the love that did not. As Elena took Sophia's hand and they walked away, the little girl turned and waved at me, a small, shy gesture that felt like a benediction. I stood there, holding the photograph, the weight in my chest gone, replaced by a quiet, reverent awe. The conflict was resolved not by fixing the past, but by finally seeing it clearly. The path had led me from the darkness of self-recrimination into the light of a truth that was far more profound and far more sacred than I could have ever imagined. I never went back to that cemetery to apologize again. The apology I had carried for 3 years, the words I had practiced to whisper to a slab of granite, felt irrelevant now, a script for a play that had never actually been performed. The true conversation had happened not with the dead, but with the living. The how of that day at the grave, the answer to the question of how my greatest failure became a hidden miracle, was not found in a medical file or a moment of divine intervention. It was found in the quiet, terrifying, and magnificent strategy of a mother's heart. Isabella didn't die despite my best efforts. In a way I am still learning to comprehend. She died because of them, or more precisely, she used the context of my efforts as the stage for her sacrifice. My confidence was the cover for her secrecy. My narrow focus on her cardiomyopathy was the distraction that allowed her pregnancy to remain hidden. My perceived failure at the moment of her death was the precise, necessary curtain call that allowed the real finale, the birth of her daughter, to begin. The miracle wasn't that Sophia lived. The miracle was the intricate, painful, and breathtakingly courageous series of choices Isabella made every single day to ensure that she would. That photograph Elena gave me, the one of Isabella dancing with her hand on her belly, now sits on my desk in my home office. It's the first thing I see when I sit down to work and the last thing I see when I leave. It has become my true chart on Isabella, replacing the thick clinical folder that now feels like a collection of irrelevant data points. I no longer see a patient when I look at it. I see a teacher. Her case, which I once thought had broken me as a physician, has in fact remade me. I still practice medicine, but the lens through which I view my patients has been permanently altered. I no longer see just a diagnosis walking into the room. I see a universe of hidden stories, of secret battles, of private loves and fears that I may never be privy to. I listen more. I ask different questions. I have learned to respect the silence between a patient's words, to look for the subtext in their hesitation. I am humbled in the truest sense of the word, understanding now that my knowledge, while vast, is always and forever limited by the infinite complexity of the human spirit. I am a better doctor because of her, not in spite of my failure, but because I was forced to see that what I labeled as failure was merely my ignorance of a greater, more profound victory. My relationship with Elena and Sophia did not end at the cemetery gates. We have formed a quiet, unexpected friendship, bound by the extraordinary woman who connects us. I am not a father figure to Sophia, nor would I ever presume to be, but I am a friend, a familiar and trusted presence in her life. Sometimes on a Saturday afternoon, I will meet them at a park. I watch Sophia run and play, her laughter a sound that now feels like a direct message from her mother, a confirmation that every ounce of that suffering was worth it. Elena and I will talk, and sometimes we speak of Isabella, sharing a memory, and other times we simply sit in a comfortable silence, two people who shared a traumatic, defining secret and have found a measure of peace in its aftermath. They have allowed me into their world, a world that exists as the living proof of Isabella's love, and in doing so, they have given me a gift far greater than any absolution I could have sought at her grave. The moral of the story, the spiritual truth that has rewired my soul, is that our deepest wounds are often the very places where the light enters us, if we are only brave enough to stop picking at the scab and let it heal into a new kind of sight. For years, I nursed the wound of my failure, believing it was a permanent stain on my identity. I thought my value as a doctor was tied to my success rate, to my ability to cheat death. Isabella taught me that death is not always the enemy, and that success cannot be measured by a single heartbeat. True success is sometimes found in the grace of a surrender to a love so large it encompasses death itself. My wound, the one I thought was a mark of shame, was actually a sacred opening, a crack that allowed me to see a dimension of human courage and love I would have otherwise been blind to. It taught me that the most important truths are often hidden in plain sight, guarded by silence and sacrifice, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. I often think about the concept of a hidden miracle. We expect miracles to be grand, obvious things, the tumor that vanishes, the heart that restarts against all odds. But Isabella's miracle was different. It was a quiet, strategic, and painfully earned miracle. It was a miracle built on a foundation of deception, fear, and unimaginable strength. It was a miracle that required a death to give life. It was hidden in the false smiles she gave me, in the pills she didn't swallow, in the secret sonograms, in the whispered promises to her sister. It was a miracle that looked, from my perspective, exactly like my greatest professional catastrophe. And that is the final, most humbling lesson. The universe's most profound work often looks like our most profound failure from our limited point of view. We are all walking through our lives, interpreting events through the narrow keyhole of our own perceptions, completely unaware of the vast, interconnected tapestry being woven around us. So I no longer visit Isabella's grave. I don't need to. I carry her with me. I see her in the determined set of Sophia's jaw when she's concentrating on a drawing. I hear her in Elena's soft, accented laughter. I feel her in the newfound patience and depth I bring to my practice. Her story did not end on that Tuesday morning in the ICU. It was simply transferred, like a sacred baton, from her failing heart to the strong, beating heart of her daughter, and in a smaller but no less significant way, to me. The day I stood at her grave, I was a man haunted by a ghost. I walked away, a man humbled by a legacy. The guilt is gone, not because I was forgiven, but because I finally understood that there was nothing to forgive. I was not a failed God trying to command life and death. I was a human being, privileged to have been a small, unwitting part of a love story so powerful that it transcended both. And in the end, being a part of that, even in the dark, is a greater honor than any successful surgery I will ever perform.